Tonight, let the day fall away from you. Whatever you carried through the hours, the conversations that circled without landing, the weight of things left undone, the quiet tension that has been sitting in your chest since this morning. You do not need to carry any of it here. This is a place where nothing is asked of you. You do not need to be anywhere else. You do not need to be anyone else. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. And the night outside your window, whatever it looks like, whether the sky is clear or clouded, whether the city is still humming or the house has finally gone quiet, the night is not waiting for you to do anything. It is simply here, the way it has always been here, holding everything gently in the dark. And wherever you are listening from tonight, you are welcome here. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. You might be surprised how many others are lying in the dark right now, just like you, looking for a softer way to end the day. There is something quietly beautiful about that. All these people, in all these different rooms, in all these different cities, choosing the same gentle hour to rest. Tonight, we will travel through a collection of stories, some very old, some not so old at all, that carry within them the kind of wisdom that does not ask you to study or memorize or take notes. These are not lessons to follow. They are not instructions to remember. There is nothing you need to understand tonight, and nothing you need to carry with you into tomorrow. They are simply stories, the kind that have been told in quiet voices for thousands of years, passed from one person to another, the way a candle passes its flame without losing any of its own light. And stories, when told quietly enough, have a way of finding the exact place in you that needs them most, not because you are searching for them, but because they are searching for you. You do not need to listen carefully. You do not need to follow every word or keep track of every character. If your mind drifts, let it drift. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. The stories will still be here, moving through the dark like a river that does not need you to watch it in order to flow. Some of these stories come from the ancient Buddhist tradition, from the same gentle wisdom that has helped people rest a little easier for over 2,500 years. But you do not need to know anything about Buddhism to receive them. They are not about doctrine or philosophy. They are about the things you already know in your body. The way it feels to finally let go of something heavy. The way a deep breath can change the shape of a difficult night. The way the simplest truth is often the one you have been stepping over for years. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism or Zen or any tradition at all to receive what these stories have to offer. They have survived for centuries, not because they belong to any one philosophy, but because they belong to everyone. They speak to something ordinary and universal. The way we hold on too tightly, the way we search for peace in all the wrong places, the way we forget to be gentle with ourselves at the end of a long day. If this path of quiet stories calls to something in you, you are welcome to subscribe and return to this space whenever you need a slower night. So, settle in now. Let your body grow heavy against whatever is holding you. Take one slow, deep breath, not to fix anything, not to prepare for anything, just to arrive. Feel the air come in and feel it go. And let us begin our journey together. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. Our first story begins in a place where the mountains meet the clouds, and where a woman once learned that the tightest grip is the one that lets everything slip through. In a valley where the fog came down each evening, like a curtain being drawn across a stage, there lived a woman who grew tea. Her terraces climbed the hillside in narrow steps, each one no wider than a footpath, and from the highest terrace you could see the river far below, winding through the trees like a silver thread pulled loose from a garment. The soil there was dark and cold in the mornings. The kind of cold that seeped through your knees when you knelt in it. The kind that made your fingers stiff before the sun had risen high enough to warm them. She would arrive at the terraces before dawn, most days, pressing her hands into the earth to feel whether it had rained in the night, and her fingers were always stained with that deep brown black of soil that has been tended for generations. Her workshop sat at the base of the terraces, a wooden structure with a slanted roof that collected rainwater into a stone basin by the door. Inside, the air smelled of dried leaves and charcoal, and something faintly sweet, like honey left in a warm room, that she could never quite name, no matter how many years she spent in that space. The walls were lined with clay jars, each one labeled in her own careful handwriting. Spring harvest, autumn harvest, the batch from the year the river flooded, the batch from the year her mother passed. She kept records of everything. She measured the temperature of the water with a glass thermometer that had belonged to her grandmother. She timed the roasting to the minute, adjusting the charcoal with iron tongs, watching the color of the leaves change the way a painter watches paint dry. And this was precisely her difficulty. She controlled everything she could reach. The angle of the drying racks, the humidity in the storage room, which she adjusted by opening and closing a small window near the ceiling. The exact moment to pick each leaf, not too young, not too old, not after rain when the moisture would dilute the flavor, not before a frost when the cold would make the leaves brittle. And yet, every season, something would go wrong that she had not planned for. A late frost that crept down the mountain in the middle of the night, an unexpected wind from the east that scattered the drying leaves across the courtyard, a batch that tasted flat and dull for no reason she could identify, despite following every step exactly as she had done the year before. And each time something slipped beyond her careful control, she felt it as a personal failure, as though the universe were giving her an examination, and she kept handing in the wrong answers. One autumn, when the leaves had just begun to turn, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming rain, a wandering monk passed through the valley. He was old, the kind of old, where the body has become lighter instead of heavier, as though the years had been slowly removing things that were no longer needed. He carried a walking stick that was more branch than staff, and he stopped at her workshop because the smell of roasting tea had reached the road. She offered him a cup, as was custom in the valley, and he sat on the wooden step outside her door and drank it slowly, holding the cup with both hands, the way you hold something precious. "This is very good tea," he said. She shook her head. "It should be better. The rain came at the wrong time this year. I lost nearly a third of the harvest." The monk looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with the kind of quiet attention that made her feel he was seeing something she could not see herself. "And what did you do when the rain came?" he asked. "I covered what I could. I moved the drying racks inside. I worked through the night, carrying everything under the roof before the water could reach it. And still you lost a third." "Yes. Tell me," the monk said, leaning his stick against the wall beside him. "When you plant a seed in the spring, do you decide when it will sprout?" She frowned. "No, the soil and the rain and the warmth decide that." "And when the leaves grow on the bush, do you decide their shape?" "Of course not." "And when the wind comes down the mountain, do you decide its direction?" "No one decides the wind." "Then why?" the monk said, and his voice was so gentle, it was almost lost in the sound of the breeze moving through the tea bushes. "Do you carry the weight of the wind on your shoulders?" She did not answer right away. She stood and poured him another cup, and as she did, she noticed that her hands were gripping the handle of the teapot, harder than they needed to, harder than the weight of the pot required, harder than the task demanded. She had been gripping things like this for as long as she could remember. The monk took the cup and held it loosely, so loosely she thought he might drop it. But he did not drop it. He simply held it the way you hold something when you trust it will not fall. The way you hold a sleeping child. The way you hold a handful of water when you have stopped trying to keep it from leaking through your fingers. The tea does not become good because you control it, he said quietly. The tea becomes good because you show up each morning and do your part. The rain, the frost, the wind, that was never yours to carry. You have been holding the weight of the sky and wondering why your arms are tired. He finished his second cup, thanked her, and continued up the road. She watched him go until the fog swallowed his figure. And then she stood there a little longer in the doorway of her workshop, holding the empty teapot in hands that had begun, without her choosing it, to soften their grip. You know this feeling. You may know it very well, perhaps better than you would like to admit, the exhaustion that comes, not from doing too much, but from trying to hold everything in place. The invisible labor of making sure nothing goes wrong, which of course is impossible, because things go wrong all the time, not because you failed, not because you were not careful enough, simply because that is how the world moves. The Buddha once offered this gentle observation: you can hold water in a cup, but you cannot hold it in a fist. And most of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from the tightness of our grip on what we wish would happen instead. Tonight, if you are lying here with a mind still trying to manage tomorrow, still rehearsing, still adjusting, still holding the reins, perhaps you can notice your hands right now. Wherever they are resting, are they clenched? Are the fingers curled? Or have they already begun, even slightly, to open? There is another story that moves through this same quiet truth, but it begins in a very different place. It begins with a clock and a young man who believed that if he could keep everything wound tightly enough, nothing would ever fall apart. In a workshop on a narrow street, where the noise of traffic could be heard through the thin walls like a low and constant hum, a young man repaired watches and clocks. He had learned the trade from his grandfather, who had learned it from his own father, and the workshop was filled with the soft ticking of dozens of timepieces. Wall clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches, laid open on velvet cloths, all slightly out of sync with one another, so that the room seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, like a heart with too many chambers, like a heart. The workbench was old oak, scarred with decades of tiny scratches from fine tools, and a single lamp with a green glass shade cast a warm circle of light over whatever mechanism he was examining. The air smelled of machine oil and old wood, and the faint metallic sharpness of brass. He was good at his work. His hands were steady. His eyes, trained by years of peering through magnifying loupes at gears no bigger than a grain of rice, could spot a misalignment that most people would never notice. He had a patience for small things, for the intricate and the invisible, that surprised everyone who knew him outside the workshop. Because outside the workshop, his patience vanished entirely. He planned his days to the minute. He kept lists, lists of tasks, lists of goals, lists of things he needed to accomplish before he could allow himself to feel that the day had been worthwhile. He reviewed these lists in the morning, updated them at lunch, and evaluated them at night, scoring himself on how many items he had completed. And when the day did not go according to the list, which was most days, because days rarely cooperate with lists. He would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through everything he should have done differently. The ceiling of his bedroom had a small crack in the plaster, and he had spent many hours studying that crack in the dark, as though it were a map to somewhere he could not quite reach. His grandfather, who was very old now and moved slowly, still came to the workshop some mornings. He would sit in the corner chair, a leather chair so worn that it had molded to the shape of his body over the decades, and read a book or simply watch his grandson work. He rarely spoke, but one evening, as the young man was locking the display cases and checking the door lock twice, as he always did, the old man set his book down. "You remind me of a clock I once repaired," the old man said. "A beautiful clock. Swiss movement, very precise. The finest mechanism I had seen in 40 years. But the owner had wound it too tightly. Not once, but every single day, tighter than the spring could bear. And eventually the mainspring cracked." The young man stopped, his hand still on the lock. "What happened to it?" "I replaced the spring. It took me 3 weeks to find the right one. But the new spring was no different from the old one. It was made of the same steel. It had the same tolerance. It would crack too, if wound the same way." "So, what did you tell the owner?" The old man smiled, a slow smile, the kind that takes its time arriving. "I told him that a clock does not run better because you wind it tighter. A clock runs best when you wind it just enough, and then trust the mechanism to do what it was built to do." He stood slowly from the chair, tucking his book under his arm. He crossed the workshop in small, careful steps and stopped beside his grandson. "You are winding yourself too tightly," he said. "Not because you are broken, not because the mechanism is faulty, but because you do not trust that you will keep running if you stop winding." The young man wanted to argue. He wanted to say that without the lists, without the planning, without the constant adjusting and tightening, everything would unravel. But he looked at the clocks on the wall behind his grandfather, all of them ticking steadily, reliably, none of them being wounded at that moment. And he found that he had no argument to give. His grandfather put a hand on his shoulder. The hand was light and warm. "The lists will still be there in the morning, but tonight let the spring rest." The young man locked the door, once, not twice, and walked home through streets that were quieter than he usually noticed them to be. The air was cool against his face. Somewhere above a bakery, someone was playing a guitar, and the melody drifted down to the sidewalk like something that had been left out in the evening air for anyone who wanted it. He did not check his phone. He did not review his list. He simply walked, and the walking, for the first time in a very long time, was enough. Shun Yuzuki, one of the great teachers who helped bring Zen practice to the West, once offered a deceptively simple observation. He said that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. What he was pointing toward, perhaps, is that the more tightly we grip our idea of how things should go, the narrower our world becomes. We stop seeing what is actually here because we are so busy comparing it to what we planned. We stop hearing the guitar above the bakery. We stop feeling the cool air on our face. We become experts at our own suffering. There is an old Zen story, barely a story at all, really, more of a whisper passed between monks in the quiet hours before dawn, about a student who went to his teacher after many years of devoted practice. The student was earnest. He had sat through long winters on the meditation cushion. He had swept the floors of the monastery until his hands were calloused. He had given everything he had to the practice, and still he felt he was failing. He knelt before his teacher in the meditation hall, The afternoon light was falling in long, dusty rectangles across the wooden floor. Somewhere outside, a bird was calling, the same two notes, over and over, patient and unhurried. "I have been meditating for 10 years," the student said, "and I still cannot control my thoughts." The teacher looked at him for a very long time, and then, with a voice so quiet the student had to lean forward to hear it, the teacher said, "Who asked you to?" The student opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He had no answer. He knelt there on the worn wooden floor, in the rectangle of afternoon light, and realized, slowly, the way dawn arrives, that he had spent 10 years trying to accomplish something that had never been asked of him. No one had told him to control his thoughts, not his teacher, not the texts, not the Buddha himself. The student had simply assumed that was the task. He had invented a problem and then spent a decade failing to solve it. And in that moment of having no answer, no argument, no plan, something in him released, not because he had found the solution, but because he finally understood that there was no problem to solve. There had never been a problem, only the belief that there should be one. The Buddha himself, in one of his gentlest teachings, compared the mind to water. When you try to hold water still, it resists. It pushes against your hands. It finds every gap between your fingers. But when you simply leave water alone, when you stop stirring it, stop grasping at it, it settles on its own. It becomes clear, not because you forced clarity upon it, but because clarity is what water does when it is left in peace. Tonight, lying here in the dark, perhaps your mind is doing what minds do, wandering, circling, picking things up and setting them down, only to pick them up again. You have been managing your thoughts all day, directing them, organizing them, winding the spring tighter and tighter. And now, in this quiet hour, you do not need to manage anything at all. You do not need to stop your thoughts. You do not need to control the direction of your mind. You have been doing that since you woke up this morning. This is the hour when the spring can rest. This is the hour when the water can settle. And perhaps, even now, something in your body has already begun to respond to these stories. Perhaps the shoulders have dropped, just a fraction, just enough to notice. Perhaps the jaw has loosened its grip, without you asking it to. Perhaps the hands have uncurled. This is not something you need to create or direct. It is something that happens when you stop telling your body what to feel. Your body has been listening to these stories too, and it already knows what to do with them. It has always known. Thich Nhat Hanh, the beloved teacher who spent his life showing others how to find peace in the simplest moments, once wrote that feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is the anchor. You do not need to practice conscious breathing right now. But if you notice your breath, just this breath, just this one, without trying to change it or deepen it or make it anything other than what it already is, you are already doing what the tea grower learned after years of gripping too tightly. You are already doing what the young watchmaker discovered on his walk home through the quiet streets. The noticing is enough. The noticing has always been enough. Let us rest here for a moment. Take one more slow breath. Feel the weight of your body pressing gently into whatever is holding you. Notice what has already begun to soften. In your shoulders, in your jaw, in the space behind your eyes. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next story begins not with a person, but with a question. One that a very old gardener once asked himself on a morning when nothing in his life had gone according to plan. It is a story about something we all carry without realizing it. The quiet, relentless belief that who we are is somehow not enough. In a town built along the edge of a wide, slow-moving river, there lived a man who collected things. Not unusual things, not antiques, or rare coins, or anything that would catch a stranger's eye. He collected ordinary things. He had 7 umbrellas, though he only ever used one. He had 3 sets of bed sheets still in their packaging, stored in a closet that he opened every few weeks just to count them. He had cans of food stacked in neat rows along the back wall of his kitchen, enough to last him months. And each time he went to the market, he bought more, even when the shelves were already full. His house was small but tidy, set back from the river on a lane, where the neighbors all knew one another's names. The front door was painted blue, a pale, watery blue that had faded unevenly in the sun. And the garden out front had gone a little wild because he spent more time organizing the inside than tending the outside. The kitchen window looked out over the river, and in the evenings, when the light turned the water gold and the current slowed to something barely visible, the view was the kind that made visitors stop mid-sentence just to look. But the man rarely looked. He was usually counting something, or rearranging something, or making a list of things he still needed to buy. The neighbors liked him. He was quiet, polite, always willing to lend a hand when the lane flooded in spring, or when someone needed help carrying something heavy. He brought bread to the elderly couple at the end of the lane every Saturday morning, and he never forgot anyone's birthday. But they worried about him. They saw the deliveries arriving, boxes of things no single person could use. And they saw the way he checked the locks on his door 3 times before walking to the market. And they understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that something in him was hungry in a way that food could not satisfy. He was not greedy. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. He did not want more because he loved having more. He wanted more because he was afraid of having less. Somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he had never examined closely, there was a feeling, quiet, constant, like a low hum that never stopped, that what he had was not enough, that he was one emergency, one unexpected expense, one bad month away from losing everything. And so he gathered. He stocked, he prepared, and the preparing never ended because the feeling of not enough never ended. It simply moved from the kitchen to the closet to the garage to the bank account, always one step ahead of him, always pointing at the next empty space and whispering, "This too needs to be filled." One spring, the river flooded, not dramatically. It was a slow flood, the kind that creeps rather than crashes, the water rising an inch each day until the lane was ankle deep and the neighbors were carrying their furniture to the 2nd floor. The man spent 3 frantic days moving his collections upstairs. Every can, every umbrella, every folded sheet. He worked until his back ached and his hands shook, and when the water finally reached the front step of his house, he stood in the doorway, looking at the muddy street, and felt, for the first time, that he could not carry any more. An elderly woman who lived across the lane, a woman who had lived through 4 floods in her lifetime, and treated each one with the same calm patience, waded through the shallow water, and handed him a cup of tea. She had made it on a portable stove on her 2nd floor, and it was still hot. "You look like a man who has been carrying something heavier than cans," she said. He took the tea, but did not drink it. "I do not have enough," he said. "I thought I did, but I do not." She looked at him, then looked at the river, then looked back at him. Enough for what? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He did not know how to finish the sentence. Enough for what? Enough for an emergency? He had enough for a dozen emergencies. Enough to feel safe? He had never felt safe, no matter how much he stored. The question sat between them, like a stone dropped in still water. and the ripples kept spreading. "My grandmother used to say something," the old woman said, sitting down on the top step where the water had not yet reached. She said, "The one who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." I did not understand it when I was young. I thought it was about money. But it is not about money at all. She paused, blowing on her tea. It is about the feeling of not enough. It is not telling you the truth about your cupboard. It is telling you something about your mind. He sat down beside her. The tea was warm in his hands. Across the lane, the river moved slowly, carrying branches and leaves and someone's garden chair. And it did not seem troubled by any of it. It simply carried what came and let go of what passed. "How do I make the feeling stop?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. The water lapped gently against the bottom step. A bird landed on the railing of the porch across the lane, shook the water from its wings, and flew off again. "When I was your age," she said, "I saved every coin I earned. I hid them in a jar under the floorboards, and every night I would count them. I thought that when the jar was full, I would finally feel safe. But the jar was never full. No matter how many coins I put in, it was never full. Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because the jar had no bottom. The feeling of not enough. It is not a jar you can fill. It is a jar with no bottom. You can pour your whole life into it, and it will never be full. Then what do you do?" She smiled. The slow, unhurried smile of someone who has made peace with a question that has no perfect answer. You stop pouring. You set the jar down, and you look around at what you already have. Not what you might lose, what you already have. Right now. This tea, this step, this conversation. What the old woman was pointing toward, without ever using the word, is one of the oldest observations the Buddha ever offered. He noticed that human beings carry within them a kind of hunger, not for food, not for shelter, but for more. The Pali word is tanha, which means thirst, not the thirst of a body that needs water, but the thirst of a mind that believes it is always one thing short of being complete. One more purchase, one more achievement, one more reassurance. And the nature of this thirst is that it cannot be satisfied by getting more, because the thirst itself is not about what is missing. It is about the belief that something is missing. This is not a teaching that asks you to want less or to deny yourself comfort. It is not about poverty or renunciation or giving away your possessions. It is a much gentler observation than that. It simply says, look at the feeling itself. Not at what you think you need, but at the needing. Look at the hunger, not the menu. Is the hunger telling you the truth about your life? Or is it a habit, an old familiar hum that has been running in the background for so long that you have mistaken it for reality? The man by the river had enough cans to last 6 months and still felt he was one day away from ruin. The feeling had nothing to do with cans. Dogen, the great Zen master who founded an entire school of practice on the idea that ordinary life is already sacred, once wrote something that sounds almost too simple to be profound. He said, "To be enlightened is to be intimate with all things." What he meant, in part, is that peace does not arrive when you have gathered enough. Peace arrives when you stop and actually see what is already here. Here, the cup of tea in your hands, the sound of water moving past, the warmth of another person sitting beside you on a step. The intimacy is not something you earn. It is something you notice. There is another way to see this, a story from a very different life, but the same quiet truth moving underneath. In a small apartment above a bakery, a young woman sat at a desk covered in papers and open notebooks. She was studying. She was always studying, for an examination that was still 3 months away. The apartment was warm because the ovens below ran from 4 in the morning until late afternoon. and the smell of bread rose through the floorboards, so that everything in the apartment, the curtains, the blankets, even the pages of her books, carried a faint sweetness. The window beside her desk was cracked open, and through it she could hear the sound of the street below. A bicycle bell, a child calling for someone, the rhythmic scraping of a shop owner sweeping the sidewalk. She had come to the city 2 years ago with a single suitcase and a feeling in her stomach that she would have described, if anyone had asked, as a kind of permanent incompleteness. She had done well in school. She had earned a place at the university. She had received marks that her professors praised. And yet each time she accomplished something, each grade, each paper, each small victory, the feeling did not go away. Instead, it shifted. It pointed to the next thing, the next hurdle, the next examination, and said, "Yes, but this is the one that really matters. This is the one where you will finally prove that you are enough." Her desk was positioned so that the lamplight fell across her notebooks at exactly the right angle. She had moved it 4 times before finding the spot. On the wall above the desk, she had pinned a calendar with the examination date circled in red, and every morning she counted the days remaining and felt the number pressing against her chest like a hand. She studied late into the evenings, long after the bakery below had closed and the ovens had cooled and the street had gone quiet. She studied with a kind of intensity that left her exhausted but unable to sleep, because even when her eyes were closed, her mind was still turning pages, still reviewing, still searching for the gap in her preparation that she was certain existed somewhere. One evening, she went downstairs to buy bread before the bakery closed. The baker, a large, quiet man with flour in the creases of his hands, and a calm that seemed as permanent as the ovens themselves, was wiping down the counter. There was 1 loaf left, and he handed it to her still warm. "You study too much," he said. It was not a question. She shrugged. "The examination is important." "Important for what?" She paused. "For my future, for my career, for everything." The baker leaned on the counter. He looked at her the way someone looks at a photograph of themselves when they were younger, with recognition and with a kind of tenderness. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "When you pass the examination, and I believe you will, what will you do then?" She thought about it. "Apply for a position, start working, and then work hard, move up, and then..." She hesitated. She could feel where the questions were going, and she did not want to follow them to their destination. The baker nodded, as though her hesitation had answered him. "I have been baking bread for 31 years, he said. "Every morning I wake up at 3:30. I mix the dough, I shape it, I put it in the oven, and every morning, for about 20 of those years, I used to think, this is not enough. I should have a bigger bakery. I should sell more kinds of bread. I should be more successful." He paused, looking down at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "And then, one morning, I do not remember which morning, it was not a special day. I was shaping a loaf, and I realized that my hands knew exactly what to do. They had always known, and the bread was good. It had always been good. And the people who came in every morning were happy. They had always been happy. Nothing had changed except that I stopped arguing with what was already true." He wrapped the loaf in paper and handed it to her. "You are already enough," he said. "The examination will not change that. It will only change what other people call you." She carried the bread upstairs and set it on the desk beside her notebooks. She did not study that night. She sat by the open window and ate a piece of bread still warm from the oven, and listened to the quiet street, and for the first time in a very long time, the feeling in her stomach, that permanent incompleteness, went quiet, not because it had been answered, but because, for one evening, she had stopped asking the question. An ancient teaching, often attributed to the Buddha, says, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." It is one of those phrases that sounds like a riddle until you stop trying to solve it and simply sit with it, the way you might sit with a warm loaf of bread and an open window on a quiet street. It does not mean that goals are meaningless or that ambition is wrong. It means that the peace you are looking for is not at the end of the road. It is in the walking. It is in this breath. It has been here the whole time, waiting for you to stop rushing past it. Pema Chodron, the American teacher who has spent decades helping people make friends with their own difficult feelings, once observed that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. The feeling of not enough is not your enemy. It is simply a visitor that has stayed too long, because no one has looked at it directly and said, "I see you. You can go now." And there is a very small parable, old origin unknown, passed between teachers like a pebble, worn smooth by many hands, about a fish who swam through the entire ocean searching for water. The fish asked every creature it met, "Where is the water?" And every creature pointed in a different direction. The fish swam and swam, exhausted, desperate, convinced that the water must be somewhere else, somewhere it had not yet looked. Until one day, the fish stopped swimming, and in the stillness, it realized it had been swimming in water the whole time. It had never left. The water had never been missing. Only the knowing had been missing. Tonight, in this quiet hour, perhaps that feeling is here with you. Perhaps you went to bed carrying the quiet weight of not enough done today, not enough prepared for tomorrow, not enough progress toward whatever finish line your mind has drawn for you. And perhaps, lying here, you can allow yourself to consider the possibility, just for tonight, just for this 1 hour, that the finish line is not real, that you have already arrived, not because everything in your life is perfect, but because this moment, this breath, this body resting in the dark, this quiet voice in your ear, is not missing anything. It is whole. You are whole, not because of what you have accomplished, but simply because you are here. Perhaps the hands have softened again. Perhaps the feet, wherever they are resting, feel a little heavier than they did a moment ago, sinking gently, the way things sink when they are finally allowed to rest. Perhaps the chest has opened, just slightly, the way a door opens when you stop leaning against it. Perhaps the jaw has released a tension you did not even know it was holding. You do not need to notice these things, but if you do, if you catch even one small softening happening somewhere in your body, that is enough. That noticing, that quiet and effortless attention to what is already here, is the only practice this moment has ever required. The fish does not need to search for water. The water is already here. It has always been here. Let us rest here together. Take a slow breath. Let the weight of the body settle a little deeper. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a story waiting for us about a man who learned to stop rushing, not from a teacher, not from a book, but from a tree that had been growing in the same place for 300 years. It is a story about patience and about the strange relief that comes when you finally stop trying to make things happen faster than they want to go. On the outskirts of a village that sat in the crease between two low hills, there was a camphor tree that had been growing for over 300 years. Its trunk was so wide that 4 people holding hands could not reach around it. Its roots had lifted the stone wall of the nearby temple over the decades, slowly, patiently, the way water lifts a boat, not with force, but with the quiet accumulation of time. The bark was dark and deeply furrowed, like the face of someone who has seen everything and chosen not to speak about most of it. In spring, its leaves gave off a cool medicinal scent that drifted across the road and into the open windows of the houses nearby. And in summer, its canopy threw a circle of shade so deep that the ground beneath it stayed cool even in the middle of the afternoon. A man who had recently moved to the village liked to walk past the tree each morning on his way to work. He was a builder, not of houses, but of furniture. He had a small workshop at the edge of the village, a rented space with a corrugated metal roof that drummed when it rained and pinged in the heat when the sun hit it at midday. Inside, the floor was covered in a fine dust of wood shavings that crunched softly underfoot, and the walls held rows of chisels and planes and hand saws arranged by size, each one hanging from its own nail. The air smelled of freshly cut timber, cedar mostly, which gave everything a warm, resinous sweetness, and of the linseed oil he used to finish each piece. A single window at the back of the workshop looked out onto a bamboo grove, and in the mornings, when the light came through the bamboo in thin green stripes, the workshop felt like a place that existed slightly apart from the rest of the world. His hands were rough and nicked from years of working with blades and sandpaper, and there was always a faint smell of sawdust in his hair even after he bathed. He was good at his work, but he was not patient with it. He wanted results quickly. He wanted to see the finished table standing in the room, wanted to run his hand over the smooth surface and know that it was done. The in-between, the measuring, the waiting for glue to dry, the slow shaping of a joint that had to be tested and adjusted and tested again, made him restless. He would rush through the drying time, assembling pieces before the adhesive had fully set. He would skip the final sanding because the piece looked close enough, and the furniture he made was good, sometimes very good, but it was never as good as it could have been, because he could not bear the waiting that excellence required. His impatience was not limited to wood. He had moved to this village because his life in the city had felt stuck. Career not advancing fast enough, relationship not deepening fast enough, savings not growing fast enough. He had expected that the move would fix things quickly, the way you expect a new coat of paint to transform a room. But 6 months in, the village was still just a village, and he was still just himself. And the restlessness had followed him, the way your shadow follows you when you change direction. One morning, he stopped beneath the camphor tree and looked up at it for a long time. A very old man was sitting on a bench nearby, a retired teacher, he had been told, who came to sit beneath the tree most mornings with a thermos of tea and a book he never seemed to finish. "How old is this tree?" the builder asked. 320 years, they say. Give or take. The builder shook his head. 300 years in the same spot. The old man looked at him with amusement. Where would it go? I mean, 300 years of just growing, just standing here. You say that as though standing here were a small thing. The old man poured tea into the thermos cap and took a sip. This tree has survived 11 typhoons. The temple wall tried to contain it, and the tree simply grew through the wall. It has outlasted every person who has ever sat on this bench. It has done all of this without hurrying a single day. The builder sat down on the other end of the bench. Through the canopy above, the morning light filtered in broken pieces, shifting whenever the breeze moved the leaves. "I am not good at waiting," he said. It came out before he could stop it. One of those confessions that slips out when you are sitting in a quiet place with a stranger who does not seem inclined to judge you. The old man nodded slowly. Most people are not. We are taught that faster is better, that the one who arrives first has won something. But the tree does not know about winning. The tree only knows about growing. And growing, if you watch it carefully, is not something that can be rushed. You can water it, you can give it good soil, but you cannot pull the branches upward and expect them to stay. So what do? Just wait? You do your work, the old man said simply. You show up each day and do the part that is yours. The glue, the sanding, the careful measuring, and then you let the rest happen at the pace it wants to happen. Not because you are passive, but because you understand that some things have their own rhythm, and fighting that rhythm is what makes you tired. The builder sat with this for a while. He watched a leaf detach from a high branch and drift down through the still air, turning slowly, taking its time, landing on the grass without a sound. It had taken perhaps 10 seconds to fall. It had not rushed. My grandfather used to say something, the old man added, setting his tea down. He said, "The farmer plants the seed and then sleeps. The seed does not need the farmer to watch it." He paused. "Your furniture, it does not need you to watch the glue dry. It only needs you to let it dry." The builder walked to his workshop that morning, a little differently than usual. He did not walk faster. He did not check his phone or rehearse his task list in his head. He noticed the road beneath his feet, the packed dirt, the small stones, the way the morning light fell across the path in long yellow stripes, where the trees thinned out and the sky showed through. He heard a stream somewhere nearby that he had never noticed before, though he had walked this road every morning for 6 months. He smelled the camphor from the tree still on his clothes, faint and clean. He opened the workshop and looked at the table he had been assembling, the joints still clamped, the glue still white and wet between the seams. He did not unclamp them. He did not test them. He sat on his workbench, poured himself tea from the thermos he kept by the door, and waited. And the waiting, for the first time in as long as he could remember, did not feel like a waste. It felt like part of the work, perhaps the most important part. You have felt this impatience. Perhaps you are feeling it right now. The quiet urgency that says, this day was not enough. This week was not enough. You are not moving fast enough toward wherever you think you are supposed to be. The Buddha once compared impatience to pulling on a young plant to make it grow faster. The pulling does not help. It only tears the roots. And yet we pull at our careers, at our relationships, at ourselves, because the waiting feels unbearable, because we have been taught that stillness is the same as stagnation. It is not. Stillness is what growth looks like from the outside. Inside, beneath the soil, everything is moving. Tonight, if there is something in your life that feels stuck, something that is not growing fast enough, not changing fast enough, not resolving fast enough, perhaps you can hold it the way the old man held his tea, loosely, patiently, knowing that 300 years of growth began with a single seed that did not try to become a tree overnight. There is a second story here, a quieter one, from a different kind of workshop, where a woman learned the same truth from a very different teacher. In a room at the back of a community center that smelled of floor polish and old curtains, a woman was learning to throw pottery on a wheel. She had taken up the craft 6 months ago, after her children had grown and left home, and the evenings had become long and echoingly quiet. The pottery studio was open 3 evenings a week, and she came to all 3, setting up her station at the same wheel in the corner, near the window that looked out onto a small garden where someone had planted rosemary and lavender. The scent drifted in when the window was open, mixing with the cool, earthy smell of wet clay. She was not naturally talented. Her bowls came out lopsided. Her mugs collapsed on the wheel when she tried to pull the walls too thin. She watched the instructor, A woman perhaps 10 years older than her, with silver hair pulled back and hands that moved over the clay with the calm authority of someone who has shaped 10,000 pots. And she felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest. Why could she not do what looked so simple? Why, after 6 months, were her pieces still uneven, still rough, still not what she saw in her mind? One evening, after a particularly frustrating session, in which 3 consecutive bowls had wobbled and collapsed, she sat at her wheel, staring at the ruined clay and said, more to herself than to anyone, I should be better by now. The instructor, who was cleaning her own wheel nearby, looked over. Better by whose clock? It has been 6 months. I come 3 times a week. I practice at home. And I still cannot make a simple bowl that does not lean. The instructor came over and sat beside her. She picked up a lump of the collapsed clay and began to knead it slowly, working it between her palms with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. When I started, the instructor said, I made terrible pots for 2 years, 2 full years, and I was young and I practiced every day. My teacher, an old man who had been potting for 50 years, told me something I did not want to hear. He said, the clay knows when you are rushing. It can feel it in your hands. When your hands are in a hurry, they press too hard. They pull too fast. They ask the clay to become something before it is ready. She handed the kneaded clay back. Your hands are in a hurry, not because they are unskilled, because your mind has already decided what the bowl should look like, and it is impatient with the clay for not matching the picture. But the clay does not care about your picture. The clay only knows what your hands are doing right now. This second, this pressure, this speed. The woman took the clay and placed it on the wheel. She wet her hands. She pressed the pedal slowly and watched the clay begin to turn. Slower, the instructor said. Slower than you think you need to go. She slowed down. The clay rose under her fingers. Not into a bowl, not yet, just upward, just becoming taller, just finding its own center. And for the first time, she felt something shift. Not in the clay, in her hands. They were not pulling. They were not pressing. They were simply there, following the clay instead of leading it. And the clay, as if it had been waiting for exactly this, began to open into a shape that was not perfect, but was for the first time truly round. She did not say anything. She just kept her hands where they were and let the wheel turn and let the clay become whatever it was becoming. The lavender from the garden drifted in through the open window. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the wheel and the faint wet sound of clay turning under wet fingers. Outside, the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, and the first stars were beginning to show. And the bowl, imperfect, slightly thick at the base, a little uneven at the rim, but unmistakably, undeniably a bowl, held its shape. She lifted her hands away, slowly, the way you lift your hands away from a sleeping child, and it stayed, because she had finally stopped asking it to be something it was not ready to be. Zen Master Dogen, who had a gift for saying enormous things in very few words, once wrote that to study the self is to forget the self. What he may have been pointing toward is that the hardest part of patience is not the waiting. It is the letting go of the picture, the image in your mind of where you should be by now. How good you should be by now, how far along the path you should have traveled. The picture is not the problem. The grip on the picture is the problem. And when you loosen that grip, when you let your hands follow the clay instead of forcing it, something happens that you could not have planned. The bowl appears, not because you made it, because you finally stopped getting in its way. There is an old saying, sometimes attributed to the Buddha, sometimes to no one at all, You cannot rush the river to the sea. The river knows the way. It has always known the way. It does not need your urgency to arrive. A very brief story to carry with you. Almost more of a picture than a story. A small scene you can hold behind your eyes as you rest. In a monastery high in the mountains, where the air was thin and cold and tasted faintly of pine, a young monk was assigned the task of sweeping the courtyard each morning. The courtyard was large, paved with flat grey stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And the wind blew leaves across it constantly, so that by the time he had swept one end, the other end was covered again. After a week of this, exhausted and frustrated, he went to the head monk and said, "This task is pointless. The leaves always come back." The head monk looked at him with great patience, the kind of patience that comes not from temperament, but from years of practice, and said, "Yes, and tomorrow morning you will sweep again." The young monk opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He looked at the courtyard. Leaves scattered across the stone in the late afternoon light, a few of them turning slowly in the breeze like tiny boats on a calm sea. And something in the seeing of it, in the beauty of the thing he had been calling pointless, made him set his broom down gently and simply stand there for a moment. He swept the courtyard the next morning, and the morning after that, and eventually he stopped noticing whether the leaves came back. The sweeping had become the point. The sweeping had always been the point. Tonight, wherever you are in your own slow becoming, whatever skill you are learning, whatever grief you are carrying, whatever chapter of your life feels like it will never resolve, your body already understands what the potter discovered. Your body knows how to be patient. It has been patiently breathing for you all day without being asked. It has been patiently beating your heart, patiently digesting your food, patiently healing the small cuts and bruises you have already forgotten about. Your body does not rush. It does not check the calendar. It simply does the next thing, and the next thing, and the next, with a faith in the process that your mind has not yet learned to match. And right now, perhaps, your body is doing its patient work again. Perhaps the breath has slowed without you choosing to slow it. Perhaps the muscles in your back have begun to release, one by one, like hands unclenching. Perhaps the weight of your head on the pillow feels a little heavier, a little more settled, a little more willing to stay. You are not doing this. It is being done, and your only task is to let it happen. Let us pause here. Let the breath come and go. Let the body settle 1 degree deeper. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next story takes a different turn. It begins with a feeling you may not expect to find in a place like this. A feeling most of us have been taught to push away, to suppress, to be ashamed of. It begins with anger, and with a woman who discovered that the thing she had been fighting was trying to tell her something important. There is a feeling that most of us have been taught to hide. We push it down, the way you push a cork beneath the surface of water. And like a cork, it always comes back up. We call it anger. And from the time we are very young, we are told that it is dangerous, that it is ugly, that it means something is wrong with us. Be calm, be patient, do not raise your voice. And so we learn to swallow it. We learn to smile when the fire is burning. We learn to say that everything is fine when everything is not fine at all. And the anger does not go away. It simply goes underground, where it becomes something harder to name. A tightness in the chest, a shortness in the voice, a sudden irritation at something small that does not deserve the weight we give it. But what if anger is not the enemy we have been told it is? What if it is something else entirely? A messenger, arriving with news we have not yet been willing to hear. There is a very old story. One of those stories that has been told so many times it has lost its original teller and now belongs to everyone, about a monk who was known throughout his monastery for his extraordinary calm. He never raised his voice, even when the younger monks were careless with their duties. He never showed frustration, even when the rains came through the roof and soaked the scriptures he had spent weeks copying by hand. He sat through long hours of meditation without flinching, and the other monks admired him greatly. They called him the Still One, and they pointed to him as an example of what devoted practice could achieve. One afternoon, a traveler came to the monastery, a merchant, passing through on his way to the coast, dusty from the road and unaware of the customs of the place. He was looking for water, and in his haste, he knocked over a wooden bucket that the monk had spent the entire morning carrying from the well at the bottom of the hill. The well was far, a 30-minute walk each way down a steep rocky path, and the bucket had taken 3 trips to fill. The water spilled across the courtyard stones in a wide, darkening circle, soaking into the cracks between the flagstones and disappearing as though it had never existed. The monk looked at the spilled water. His jaw tightened. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled slowly into fists. So slowly that no one would have noticed unless they were watching very carefully. And then, very deliberately, he uncurled his hands, arranged his face into a smooth and practiced expression, and said, in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly empty, "It is no trouble at all." The traveler apologized, filled his own water skin from the monastery kitchen, and left. But the head monk, who had been watching from the shadowed doorway of the meditation hall, watching with the kind of attention that sees what is hidden behind what is shown, walked across the courtyard and sat beside the Still One on the stone bench. "That was not calm," the head monk said quietly. The monk turned to him, surprised. "I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I did not." "No, you hid it. Hiding is not the same as calm." The head monk looked at the darkened stones where the water had vanished. "Calm that is built on hiding is not calm. It is a wall, and walls, no matter how carefully you build them, eventually crack." He was quiet for a moment, letting the silence do its work. Then he said, "The anger was there. You felt it in your hands. What did it want to tell you?" The monk was silent for a long time. A breeze moved through the courtyard, stirring the dust. Finally he said, "It wanted to tell me that I was tired, that I had carried water all morning in the heat, and no one had offered to help, that I did not want to say so, because I was afraid it would make me seem weak, or ungrateful, or less than what they expect me to be." The head monk nodded slowly. "So the anger was not the problem. The anger was the message, and you were so busy building a wall around it that you never stopped to read what it said." The Buddha, who understood the architecture of the human mind perhaps better than anyone who has ever lived, once compared anger to a burning coal. He said that holding on to anger is like picking up a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. But what is often forgotten about this teaching is that the Buddha did not say anger itself is wrong. He said the holding is the problem, the refusing to set it down, the way we grip the coal and carry it everywhere we go, burning ourselves a little more each day, because we believe that to let it go would be to say that the hurt did not matter. And there is a woman whose story carries this truth into a different kind of room. Not a monastery, but a kitchen, on an ordinary evening, in a life that looked perfectly fine from the outside. She lived in a house at the end of a quiet street, in a neighborhood where the lawns were mowed, and the fences were painted, and the neighbors waved to each other on their way to work. The kitchen was her favorite room, not because she loved cooking, though she was a competent cook, but because the window above the sink faced west, and in the evenings, the light came through it in a way that turned everything warm and gold. The countertops were old tile, cream-colored with small chips at the edges, and the refrigerator hummed a low, constant note that she had stopped hearing years ago. There was a wooden clock on the wall above the stove, a clock that had belonged to her mother, and it ticked with a steady, unhurried patience that she envied. She was not an angry person. That was what she would have told you if you had asked. And she would have believed it completely, because she had built her entire life around the careful management of this belief. She was fine. She was coping. She was managing. She was the person who held things together. At work, at home, in friendships. The one who smoothed things over. Who said it is fine when things were not fine. Who absorbed the sharp edges of other people's moods so that the room could stay comfortable. She had been doing this for so long that she no longer recognized it as effort. It was simply who she was. The easy one. The calm one. The one who never made a fuss. But there were moments, small ones, the kind that flare and fade so quickly you can pretend they did not happen. The kind you file away in a drawer you never open, when something inside her ignited, when her partner left dishes in the sink for the third day in a row. The same dishes, the same sink, the same quiet expectation that she would handle it. And she felt a heat rise in her throat that was entirely, absurdly out of proportion to a few dirty plates. When a friend cancelled plans at the last minute with a breezy text message, and she typed back no worries at all, and then stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white and her wrists ached. When someone at work presented her idea in a meeting, her idea, the one she had stayed late to develop, the one she had emailed to the team at midnight and received praise for it, and she said nothing. Nothing at all. She smiled, she nodded, she drove home with her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth ached by the time she pulled into the driveway, and she sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside, waiting for her face to rearrange itself into something that looked like peace. She did not express anger. She had learned, long ago, in a childhood, where raised voices meant danger and silence meant safety, that expressing anger made people uncomfortable, that it made her difficult, that it was safer, always safer to be agreeable, to be easy, to be the person who never needed anything, who never asked for anything, who never made a fuss. And so the anger accumulated, not in dramatic explosions, not in the way anger appears in movies, but in a slow, steady layering, like snow falling on a roof beam by beam, each flake weighing almost nothing, the accumulation, over years, weighing everything. One evening, standing at the sink washing dishes, the same dishes, always the same dishes, the water too hot against her hands because she liked the way the heat cut through the numbness. She dropped a glass. It slipped from her wet fingers and hit the tile floor and shattered with a sound that was louder than it should have been, louder than a single glass breaking in a quiet kitchen, as though the sound had been waiting for permission to be heard, and the breaking of the glass opened something in her that she had been keeping sealed for a very long time. Not rage, something quieter and older and more exhausted than rage. She stood there looking at the broken pieces, the way they caught the evening light from the window, the way they scattered across the tile in a pattern that was almost beautiful. And she began to cry, not about the glass, not about the dishes, but about all the things she had not said, all the times she had smiled when she wanted to speak, all the small fires she had swallowed and felt burning on the way down, every single one of them, leaving a scar she could not see, but could always feel. She sat down on the kitchen floor among the broken glass, carefully, slowly, placing her hands flat on the cool tile, because the coolness felt like something honest, and she let herself feel what she had been refusing to feel for years. The anger was there. It was enormous and hot, and it filled the kitchen like a presence, like another person standing in the room. But it was not destructive. It was not ugly. It was not the monster she had been taught to fear. It was, she realized with a kind of stunned and weeping clarity, trying to protect her. Every flash of irritation she had ever suppressed, every clenched jaw, every white-knuckled grip on the counter, every "it is fine" that was not fine, had been a signal, a small, desperate voice saying, "This matters to you. This boundary was crossed. This need was not met. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to take up space." The anger had never been the enemy. The silence had been the enemy. The anger had been trying all along to save her from the silence. Thich Nhat Hanh, who wrote about difficult emotions with the tenderness of a parent holding a crying child, once said that when anger arises, we should treat it the way we would treat a baby who is crying. We do not scream at the baby. We do not throw the baby out of the house. We pick the baby up. We hold it. We say, "I am here. I am listening. Tell me what you need." He said that anger is like that. It is a part of us that is crying out for attention. And the only way to calm it is not to fight it, but to hold it with care. Tonight, if there is something simmering in you, something you pushed down this morning, or this week, or years ago, you do not need to resolve it right now. You do not need to confront anyone or make any decisions. But perhaps you can do something very small. Perhaps you can simply acknowledge it, not judge it, not analyze it. Just let it be there, the way you let the sound of rain be there, present, noticed, allowed. The anger is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that something matters to you. And that mattering, that deep, fierce caring about your own life, is not a flaw. It is the most human thing about you. There is a Zen saying, brief and sharp, like a bell struck once in a silent room, that goes, "The obstacle is the path." Most of us spend our lives trying to get around the obstacle. We go over it, under it, around it. We pretend it is not there. But the Zen masters understood something counterintuitive. The very thing you are trying to avoid is the thing you need to walk through. The anger you are hiding from is the door, not because anger itself is the answer, but because what the anger is protecting, the need, the boundary, the truth you have not spoken, that is where the freedom lives. And there is one more small story here, a very old one, from a tradition that understood anger not as sin but as energy. Energy that, like fire, can destroy a house or warm it, depending on how you hold it. A young apprentice went to a blacksmith and asked to learn the trade. The blacksmith was a broad, quiet woman who had been working iron for 30 years. Her forearms were thick with muscle, and her hands, though scarred and calloused, moved over the metal with a gentleness that surprised anyone watching for the first time. She agreed to take the apprentice, and for the first month he did nothing but tend the forge, feeding it coal from the bucket by the door, adjusting the leather bellows with a steady rhythm, learning to read the color of the flame the way a sailor reads the color of the sky. Orange meant not hot enough. The metal would resist, stubborn and cold. White meant too hot. The metal would become brittle and crack. The perfect temperature was somewhere in between, a deep, steady red that pulsed like a heartbeat, alive and patient. The fire is not your enemy, the blacksmith told him one morning as the forge glowed in the dim workshop and the heat pressed against their faces like an open hand. The fire is your tool, but if you fear it, you will keep it too low. and the metal will not yield. And if you feed it carelessly, recklessly, without paying attention, it will consume everything: the metal, the workshop, the work itself. The skill is not in eliminating the fire. The skill is in knowing how much to give it, how much air, how much coal, how much of your attention. The apprentice spent years learning this balance. Years of burned fingertips and ruined mornings when the forge would not cooperate, and evenings when it sang. And one day, many years later, when he had a forge of his own and an apprentice of his own, standing by the bellows with the same nervous, uncertain hands he once had, he realized that the blacksmith had not been talking only about metal. She had been talking about the fire inside, the one that flares when something matters, the one that burns when something is wrong, the one that most people try to smother because they were never taught how to use it. You do not put it out. You do not let it rage. You learn its temperature. You learn its color. And you use it carefully, respectfully, with attention, to shape something that would not exist without the heat. Perhaps, right now, you can feel where the fire has been sitting in your body today. Perhaps it is in the jaw, that familiar clenching. Perhaps it is in the shoulders, drawn up toward the ears, like a shield. Perhaps it is in the stomach, a tight knot that has been there so long you had forgotten it was not normal. You do not need to do anything with it tonight. You do not need to fix it or release it or understand it. But if you can feel it, if you can simply notice it without turning away, then you have already done something brave. You have looked at the messenger instead of shooting it, and that is enough for tonight. That is more than enough. Let us rest here. Let the breath come in slow and go out slower. Let the body hold whatever it is holding without being asked to change. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next thread in our journey tonight moves in a very different direction, away from fire and towards something cooler, softer, more like water. It is about the one truth that most of us spend our lives resisting, and the strange comfort that comes when we finally stop resisting it. It is about the fact that nothing lasts, and why that is not as sad as it sounds. In a coastal town, where the houses were painted in fading pastels, blues and greens and yellows that the salt air had softened over the years into something gentler than their original colors, there lived a woman who made sand mandalas, not the elaborate kind made by Tibetan monks in ceremonies that take weeks. Hers were simpler, smaller, made on the flat stretch of beach below the seawall each morning before the tide came in. She would arrive just after dawn, carrying a canvas bag filled with small jars of colored sand, red and gold, and deep blue and white, and she would kneel on the damp beach and begin to pour. The sand fell from her fingers in thin, careful lines. She did not use tools, no funnels, no stencils, no guides, just her hands, steady and practiced, creating circles within circles, patterns that spiraled outward like the rings of a tree or the ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The designs were intricate and beautiful, and they took her 2 or 3 hours to complete. By the time she finished, the sun would be fully up, warming the back of her neck, and the mandala would glow against the wet sand, like something that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. And then the tide would come in. Every single time, the water would creep up the beach in slow, foaming lines, and the mandala, every grain of it, every careful curve and spiral, would dissolve. The colors would bleed into the sand, and the sand would bleed into the sea, and within 20 minutes, there would be nothing left, just wet, flat beach, as though the mandala had never existed at all. A young man who jogged along the seawall each morning had watched this ritual many times. He had seen the woman arrive, seen her kneel, seen the mandala take shape under her patient hands, and he had seen the tide erase it every time, without exception. One morning he stopped running and climbed down the stone steps to the beach. "Does it not bother you?" he asked. He was breathing hard from his run, his hands on his knees, and his voice had the slightly aggressive edge of someone who is asking a question that has been bothering him for weeks. "You spend 3 hours making something beautiful, and then the ocean just takes it." The woman did not look up. She was pouring a line of gold sand along the edge of an inner circle, her hand moving with the slow precision of someone threading a needle. "Takes it where?" she said. "I mean, it destroys it. It is gone. All that work, and then nothing." She finished the line and sat back on her heels, looking at what she had made so far. The morning light was catching the gold sand, and it seemed to pulse against the darker blue around it, like a small heartbeat. "Do you run every morning?" she asked. He was confused by the change of subject. "Yes." "And at the end of the run, what do you have?" "The run is over, the sweat dries, the endorphins fade. Tomorrow, you will have to run again. Does that make today's run meaningless?" "No, but that is different. Running is. It is for the doing of it." "Yes," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, a quiet satisfaction, as though he had arrived at exactly the place she wanted him to be. Exactly. "It is for the doing of it." She returned to her work, pouring white sand in a series of tiny dots along the outermost ring, each dot perfectly spaced, each one placed with a care that seemed almost devotional. "When you eat a beautiful meal," she continued, her voice low and steady, almost lost beneath the sound of the waves pulling back across the pebbles at the waterline, "do you feel cheated because it ends? The flavors, the textures, the warmth of the company around the table. And then it is finished. The plates are empty. The table is cleared. Does that make the meal meaningless?" "No. My mother used to say that the things we cannot keep are the things we love most honestly," the woman said. "Because when you know something will not last, you pay attention to it. You do not take it for granted. You do not look away and assume it will be there when you look back. You are fully present with it. Because you know in your body that this is the only time." She paused and looked up at him. "The tide is not the enemy of the mandala. The tide is what makes the mandala precious. If it lasted forever, I would stop seeing it. It would become furniture. It would become wallpaper. It would become something I walked past without noticing. But because it disappears, because I know from the very first grain that the ocean will come, every line I pour is an act of attention. Every curve is a kind of love, and love that knows it is temporary is the most honest love there is." The young man stood there for a while, watching her work. The tide was already turning. He could see the leading edge of the water creeping up the sand, still 50 meters away, but coming, always coming. And for the first time, instead of feeling the loss of what was about to happen, he felt something else, something closer to gratitude, not for what would remain, but for what was here, right now, in this moment that would not come again. What the woman was describing, with her colored sand and her patient hands, is one of the most central teachings the Buddha ever offered. The Pali word is anicca, impermanence, not as a philosophical concept to be debated in lecture halls, but as a living truth to be felt in the body. Everything changes. Everything passes. The breath you are taking right now will end. The night outside your window will become morning. The sadness you carried today will shift into something else tomorrow. And the joy too, will change. This is not a punishment. This is the nature of being alive. Most of us resist this truth with everything we have. We build walls against it. We accumulate things, relationships, achievements, identities, trying to create something permanent in a world that was never designed for permanence. We take photographs to freeze moments. We cling to relationships that have run their natural course. We repeat the same routines, hoping that repetition will create solidity, and the resistance itself becomes a kind of suffering. Not because the world is cruel, but because we are asking it to be something it cannot be. We are asking the tide not to come, and the tide always comes, not out of malice, not out of indifference, simply because that is what tides do. But there is another way to hold this truth, a way that the woman on the beach understood in her hands before she understood it in her mind, a way that turns impermanence from a source of grief into a source of tenderness, from a loss into a gift. If nothing lasts, then everything matters. If this moment will not come again, then this moment deserves your full, undivided attention. The coffee growing cold on the nightstand beside you, the sound of someone breathing in the next room, the particular weight of this blanket on this body on this night. None of it is permanent. All of it is precious, precisely because it will not last. The mandala is beautiful not despite the tide, but because of it. There is a second story here, set in a very different landscape, but carrying the same quiet truth like water carries light. In a village in the hills, where the autumn arrived early and announced itself without subtlety, the leaves turning colors that seemed almost impossible. Reds so deep they looked like they were lit from inside, golds that caught the low afternoon sun and threw it back in warm, scattered pieces. There lived an old man who had been a photographer for most of his life. His house was small and sat at the end of a dirt road that climbed the hill in lazy switchbacks. Inside, every surface was cluttered with decades of prints, black and white, color, large format, Polaroids fading at the edges, stacked on shelves and pinned to walls and tucked into books and leaning against furniture, as though the images had simply accumulated around him, the way leaves accumulate around the base of a tree in autumn. The kitchen table was half covered with contact sheets. The hallway smelled of fixer chemicals, a sharp, acrid scent that had soaked into the walls over the years and would never fully leave. He had photographed landscapes, mostly. Mountains at dawn, when the first light caught the snow and turned it pink. Rivers in fog, where the water and the air became indistinguishable, and the world seemed to dissolve into something softer than matter. Fields of wildflowers that existed for 3 weeks each spring. A brief, explosive bloom of purple and yellow and white, and then vanished until the following year, as though they had never been. His photographs were known for a particular quality that critics had struggled for years to name. A stillness, a quietness, as though each image had been taken in the pause between 2 breaths, in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. People said his photographs made them feel calm, made them feel that the world, despite everything, was a place worth paying attention to. He never knew quite what to do with this compliment, because the truth he had never spoken to an interviewer, was that he had not been calm when he took them. He had been terrified that the light would change before he pressed the shutter, terrified that the morning fog would lift too quickly, that the clouds would shift, that the wind would blur the flowers, terrified, always and endlessly, that the moment would pass and he would miss it and it would be gone forever. This terror had followed him for 40 years, like a faithful and unwelcome companion. It was the engine that drove his work, this desperate need to capture, to hold, to keep. And it was also the thing that exhausted him, because no photograph, no matter how beautiful, ever felt like enough. The real thing was always better. The real fog was always more luminous than the print. The real mountain was always more vast than the frame could hold. And so he took more photographs, and more, trying to close the gap between the moment and the record of the moment, and the gap never closed. One autumn, the autumn he turned 72, he walked into the hills with his camera, as he had done 10,000 times before, to photograph the changing leaves. The morning was cold and clear, and the trees along the ridge were blazing, every shade of red and gold and amber, the whole hillside burning with color against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. He set up his tripod. He adjusted the lens. He looked through the viewfinder. And then he put the camera down. He did not know why. It was not a decision he made with his mind. It was more like an exhale, something his body did before his thinking could intervene. The way you sometimes set down a heavy bag without deciding to, simply because your arms have carried it long enough. He sat down on the cold ground among the fallen leaves. They crackled softly under his weight, dry and papery and smelling of earth and tannin. And he looked at the trees, just looked, without a lens between himself and the world, without the anxiety of composition, without the frame, without the desperate lifelong need to capture and hold and keep. The colors were the same colors he had been photographing for 40 years. The light was the same October light, low, warm, raking across the hillside at an angle that made every leaf look individually lit. But without the camera, without the fear of losing the moment, he saw them differently. He saw them the way you see something when you have finally accepted that you cannot keep it, with a tenderness that was close to grief, but was not grief, with a fullness that had nothing to do with owning. He sat there for a long time, until the light shifted and the colors began to change, as they always did, as they always would, and he felt, for the first time in his career, perhaps for the first time in his life, that nothing was missing. The moment was complete. Not because he had captured it, but because he had let it go. Zen Master Ikkyu, who was known for his wild honesty and his refusal to pretend that spiritual life was neat or comfortable, once wrote a poem that goes, in rough translation, "This world of dew is only a world of dew, and yet," those last two words, "and yet," hold everything. And yet it is beautiful, and yet it breaks our hearts. And yet we love it. The impermanence is not separate from the beauty. The impermanence is the beauty. The cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall. The sunset is beautiful because it fades. And this night, this particular night, with its particular darkness and its particular quiet, is beautiful because it will become morning. And this exact configuration of stillness will never happen again. There is a very small image to rest with here. Not quite a story. More of a scene you can hold behind your closed eyes. Somewhere in the world right now. Perhaps not far from where you are lying. Perhaps in a room much like yours. A candle is burning on a windowsill. It was lit hours ago, when the evening was still young, and the room was full of conversation or music, or the quiet sounds of someone reading. The wax has pooled and hardened, and pooled again, creating small valleys and ridges in the white surface. The flame is shorter now than it was at the start of the evening, and steadier. The way things become steadier when they are no longer trying to prove anything. It does not know that it is going out. It does not count the hours it has left. It does not grieve the wax it has already burned, or compare itself to the candle it was 3 hours ago. It simply gives its light, warm, gold, flickering gently with each breath of air from the cracked window, for as long as it has light to give. And when it goes out, it will go out gently, with a thin curl of smoke that rises toward the ceiling, and then disappears, the way all things disappear. The way all moments disappear, not into nothing, but into everything that comes next. The Buddha, in one of his most tender moments, is said to have told his followers, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your own salvation with diligence." These were among his last words, and they are not as heavy as they sound. They are, in fact, an invitation to stop fighting the river and start swimming with it, to stop grieving what has passed and start noticing what is here, to stop demanding permanence from a world that was never built to provide it, and instead to marvel at what it does provide. This breath, this heartbeat, this voice in the dark, this night that will never come again. And tonight your body already understands this teaching better than your mind ever will. Your body has never tried to hold a breath permanently. It breathes in, it breathes out. It lets each breath go without mourning it. Your heart does not try to hold a single beat. It beats and releases and beats again, trusting the next moment to arrive the way the tide trusts the moon. Perhaps right now, in this quiet, you can feel the rhythm of that trust. The easy rise and fall of the chest, the steady pulse in the wrists, the way the body has already surrendered to the impermanence of each second without ever calling it loss. Your body has been practicing this teaching your entire life. It has never once tried to make a moment permanent, and it has never once run out of moments. Let the eyes grow heavier. Let the body sink 1 degree deeper into rest. You do not need to hold on to anything right now. Not to these stories, not to this voice, not to anything at all. Everything that needs to stay will stay. Everything that needs to go will go. And you will be here, breathing, held by the night, which has never once forgotten to become morning. When you are ready, we will continue together. The next story is about something very close to where you are right now. So close you might miss it. It is about the holiness hidden in ordinary things, in a cup of tea, in a broom sweeping a floor, in the simple, unremarkable act of paying attention to what is already in front of you. In a monastery that sat on the side of a mountain so steep that the stone steps leading up to it had been worn smooth by 500 years of climbing feet, there was a monk whose only job was to cook rice. He had been doing this for 23 years. Every morning, he woke before anyone else in the monastery, before the bell that called the others to meditation, before the first light touched the courtyard walls, and he walked to the kitchen in the dark. The kitchen was a large stone room at the back of the monastery, with a fire pit in the center, and copper pots hanging from iron hooks along the ceiling. The air in there was always warm, even in winter, because the coals from the previous night's fire were kept banked beneath a layer of ash, glowing faintly, like a small, patient animal that never fully slept. He would wash the rice first. This was not a quick task. He filled a deep wooden bowl with dry grain, added cold water from the stone cistern by the door, and worked the rice between his fingers in slow circles, watching the water turn cloudy with starch. He drained the water, added more, and washed again and again. 4 times, sometimes 5, until the water ran clear and the grains felt smooth and individual between his fingertips, each one separate, each one clean. The sound of the washing was quiet and rhythmic, a soft, wet rustling like rain falling on broad leaves. Then he measured the water, not with a cup. He had stopped using a cup years ago, but with his hand. He pressed his palm flat against the surface of the rice in the pot and added water until it reached a precise point on his wrist, a point he had found through years of repetition, a point his body knew even when his mind was elsewhere. He set the pot over the coals, adjusted the airflow with a small iron damper, and waited. The waiting was not empty. He listened to the water begin to murmur, then to simmer, then to the moment. And it was always a moment, a single breath in which everything changed. When the surface of the water began to dimple and dance with the first true boil, the other monks respected him, but they also pitied him, in the quiet way that people pity those they do not understand. He had been offered other roles over the years. He could have led meditation sessions, could have taught the younger monks, could have tended the garden, which was considered a more prestigious and contemplative assignment. He declined them all. He wanted to cook rice, just rice, every morning for 23 years. One day, a visiting scholar came to the monastery. He was a learned man. He had spent decades studying texts, memorizing sutras, debating the fine points of doctrine with other scholars at other monasteries. He had the kind of knowledge that fills a room when he spoke, and the monks listened to him with admiration and something close to awe. After the evening meal, rice, of course, with pickled vegetables and a thin, fragrant broth, the scholar approached the cook in the kitchen. "I have traveled to many monasteries," the scholar said, "and this is the finest rice I have ever tasted." The cook was cleaning the pot, scraping the last grains from the bottom with a wooden paddle. "Thank you. What is your secret? A special variety of grain, a particular technique?" The cook set the paddle down and thought for a moment. "I wash it until the water is clear. I measure the water with my hand. I watch the fire. I listen to the pot." The scholar waited for more. When nothing more came, he said, somewhat impatiently, "But surely there is more to it than that. A technique, a tradition, something you learned from a teacher." The cook shook his head slowly. "My teacher was an old woman who cooked rice for the monastery before me. She cooked rice for 31 years. When I asked her to teach me her secret, she said, 'There is no secret. When you wash the rice, wash the rice. When you watch the fire, watch the fire. Do not be somewhere else while your hands are here.'" He paused, wiping the inside of the pot with a cloth. "That is what every cook does," the cook continued. "But most cooks are somewhere else while they cook. They are thinking about the meditation they missed, or the sutra they should be reading, or what the abbot said to them yesterday, or what they will do when the cooking is finished. I am not somewhere else. When I wash the rice, I only wash the rice. When I watch the fire, I only watch the fire. My whole life is in that pot. All of it. Every year, every breath, every hope, right here, in the steam rising from the water." The scholar was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled softly in the pit. Somewhere outside, the evening bell was ringing, its sound rolling down the mountainside and disappearing into the valley below. He had spent 30 years studying the nature of presence, of mindfulness, of what the tradition calls right effort. He had written papers about it, he had given lectures about it, and here, in a kitchen that smelled of cooked grain and wood smoke, a man who had never written a paper in his life was living it so completely that it had become invisible, the way water is invisible to a fish. "I have been looking for the sacred in the wrong places," the scholar said, more to himself than to the cook. The cook picked up his paddle and returned to cleaning the pot. "There are no wrong places," he said gently. "Only places where we forget to pay attention." Dogen, and this is one of his most famous observations, one that has echoed through 7 centuries of Zen practice, once wrote that to cook a meal with care is itself the practice, not a break from practice, not a preparation for practice. The cooking is the practice. The washing of the rice is the meditation. The measuring of the water is the prayer. He was pointing at something that most of us walk past every single day. The idea that the sacred is not somewhere else. It is not in a special building, or a special book, or a special state of mind you have to earn through years of effort. It is here, in the next thing you do, in the way you do it, in the attention you bring to the ordinary moment that your mind has already dismissed as unimportant. Tonight you are lying in the dark. That is an ordinary thing. Millions of people are doing it right now, all over the world. Lying in the dark, waiting for sleep, listening to the sounds of the night. And yet this moment, this particular darkness, this particular body, this particular breath has never happened before and will never happen again. It is as unrepeatable as a sunrise. It is as rare as anything in the universe. The monk in the kitchen understood this. He understood that the extraordinariness of life is not hiding behind the ordinary. It is the ordinary. The rice is the rice, and the rice is everything. There was another person who came to understand this, though she arrived at it from the opposite direction. Not through years of quiet practice, but through years of searching for something louder. In a city where the buildings were so tall that the sky between them looked like a narrow blue river, a woman worked in an office on the 14th floor. She was successful by every measure that the world considers important. Good salary, respected title, an apartment with large windows that looked out over the rooftops, and, on clear days, all the way to the harbor. Her days were structured around meetings and deadlines, and emails that multiplied like cells, dividing, each one spawning two more that demanded response. She moved through these days at a speed that she had come to confuse with purpose. Speed meant productivity. Productivity meant value. Value meant she was doing her life correctly. But in the evenings, when the office emptied and the cleaning crew's vacuum cleaner hummed in the hallway, like a mechanical prayer, she would sometimes sit at her desk and feel a hollowness that she could not explain. She had accomplished things that day. She always accomplished things. That was not the problem. The problem was that the accomplishments felt like food that did not nourish. She ate and was never full. She checked items off the list, and the list grew longer. She climbed the ladder, and the ladder grew taller. And somewhere beneath the speed and the structure and the carefully maintained appearance of a life well lived, there was a question she could not quite hear, muffled beneath the noise of her own efficiency. Is this it? She took a week off, not for vacation. She was not good at vacations. She spent them checking email on her phone by the pool and feeling guilty about the things she was not doing, but because her body had simply refused to continue. A headache that lasted 4 days, a trembling in her hands that appeared during a presentation and did not leave. She was exhausted in a way that sleep did not fix, tired in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones, and even nerves, all the way down to the place where meaning lives, or where meaning used to live, before it packed its things and left without telling her where it was going. She went to the countryside. She rented a small cottage with a wood stove and a kitchen window that looked out onto an apple orchard. The trees were old and gnarled, their branches twisting in ways that suggested they had given up trying to grow straight a long time ago and had decided instead to grow however they pleased. The grass beneath them was long and unmowed, dotted with wildflowers whose names she did not know. For the first 2 days, she did not know what to do with herself. She checked her phone. She made lists. She reorganized the kitchen cupboards, which did not need reorganizing. She felt the hollowness following her, persistent as a headache, and she began to worry that it would never leave, that she had broken something inside herself that could not be fixed by a change of scenery. On the 3rd morning, she made tea, not the way she made it at home. Hurriedly, the kettle barely boiled. The bag dunked and removed in 30 seconds, carried to the desk in a travel mug that she drank from without tasting. She made it slowly. She filled the kettle and listened to the water begin to heat. A sound like a distant conversation growing closer. She chose a cup from the shelf, a ceramic cup, handmade, with a glaze that shifted from grey to blue, depending on the light. And she held it in both hands, feeling its weight, the slight roughness of the clay against her palms. She poured the water over the tea leaves and watched them unfurl slowly, like something waking up. She sat at the kitchen table by the window and drank the tea, just the tea. She did not check her phone. She did not make a list. She watched the steam rise from the cup and curl toward the ceiling, and through the window she could see an old apple tree with a bird sitting on one of its lowest branches. A small brown bird, unremarkable, singing a song that had no audience and no purpose and no end. And something happened. Not a dramatic awakening, not a thunderbolt of insight. Something much quieter. Something that felt like a door opening in a room she had forgotten existed. The tea was warm and slightly bitter, and it filled her mouth and her chest and her stomach with a warmth that was not just physical. The bird sang. The apple tree stood. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor at a pace that her entire career had been built to outrun. And she realized, not in her mind, but in her body, in the place where truth lives before language finds it, that she had spent years searching for meaning in the extraordinary when it had been waiting, all along, in the ordinary, in the cup, in the steam, in the bird she had never stopped to hear, in the simple, devastating beauty of paying attention to what is already in front of you. Thich Nhat Hanh, who spent his life teaching this very thing, who washed dishes as a meditation and walked across parking lots as a prayer, once said that the miracle is not to walk on water, the miracle is to walk on the green earth. He was not speaking in metaphor. He meant it literally. The ground beneath your feet is the miracle. The breath in your lungs is the miracle. The fact that you exist at all, that atoms arrange themselves into a body that can feel warmth and hear music and cry at beauty, is so improbable, so wildly unlikely, that every moment of consciousness is an event more extraordinary than any miracle ever recorded in any scripture. An old Zen saying puts it even more simply. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Nothing changes, everything changes. The wood is the same wood, the water is the same water. But the one who chops and carries is no longer searching for the sacred somewhere else. They have found it in the grain of the wood, in the weight of the bucket, in the sound the axe makes when it meets the log, a clean, sharp crack that rings through the cold air and then fades, the way all sounds fade, the way all moments fade, into the deep and patient silence that holds everything. There is a very small story here, more of a breath than a story, more of a gesture than a narrative. An old woman, living alone in a house at the edge of a small town where the streetlights ended and the fields began, spent each evening sweeping her kitchen floor. The floor was wooden, pine, worn smooth and pale by decades of stockinged feet and chair legs, and the quiet traffic of a life lived mostly in one room. She swept it every evening at the same time, just after dinner, using a broom made of bundled straw that whispered against the boards in a rhythm as steady and familiar as a heartbeat. A neighbor, passing by the open kitchen window one evening and hearing the sound, stopped and asked her why she swept every night when the floor was rarely dirty. She paused, leaned on her broom, and said, "I do not sweep because the floor is dirty. I sweep because sweeping is how I say good night to my house." The neighbor thought about this for a long time, and then she went home and swept her own floor, slowly, listening to the sound the broom made against the wood. And for the first time in years, she noticed how the evening light fell across the kitchen tiles in long, warm rectangles, and how the house smelled of the bread she had baked that morning, and how the silence after the sweeping was not empty, but full of the day that was ending, full of the night that was beginning, full of the ordinary life she had been too busy to notice she was living. Tonight your body is doing ordinary things, breathing, beating, settling into the mattress with the slow, unthinking surrender of a body that has done this 10,000 times before. And these ordinary things, this breath, this heartbeat, this settling, are the most extraordinary things happening anywhere in the universe right now. Not because they are rare in the cosmic sense, but because they are yours. Because you are the only one who will ever experience this particular breath, in this particular body, on this particular night. The monk in the kitchen knew this. The woman with the tea knew this. And somewhere, in a place deeper than thought, you know it too. Perhaps the breath has slowed again. Perhaps the body has grown a little heavier. Perhaps the eyes, if they are still open, are beginning to feel the gentle pull of gravity that comes just before sleep. The soft, warm weight of the eyelids wanting to close. You do not need to resist this. There is nothing left to understand. There is only rest and the quiet holiness of resting. Let us pause here. Let the silence hold you for a moment. Not an empty silence, but a full one, full of everything we have traveled through tonight. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more story I would like to share with you before we begin our journey toward rest. It is about the hardest person in the world to be kind to, which, for most of us, is not a stranger, not a difficult colleague, not even someone who has hurt us. It is ourselves, and it begins with a very simple question that a tired man once asked himself on a night, much like this one. Here is something strange about being human. If a friend came to you tonight, tired, overwhelmed, carrying the weight of a day that had not gone the way they hoped, you would know exactly what to say. You would tell them to rest. You would tell them that one difficult day does not define them. You would tell them that they are doing better than they think, that they are allowed to struggle, that struggling is not the same as failing. You would say these things easily, naturally, without hesitation, because you believe them. You believe them deeply, instinctively, the way you believe that the sun will rise in the morning. But when you are the one who is tired, when you are the one lying in the dark, running through their day's mistakes, cataloging your shortcomings, measuring yourself against some impossible standard that you would never apply to anyone else, the gentleness vanishes. The voice inside your head is not the voice you would use with a friend. It is harder, colder. It says, "You should have done better. You should have known. You should be further along by now. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you?" As though something must be wrong. As though the tiredness and the struggling and the falling short are evidence of a defect, rather than evidence of a life being fully lived. There is a small parable, very old, passed between teachers in the way that seeds are passed between gardeners, each one planting it in slightly different soil. About a man who lived in the mountains and owned 2 horses. The stable behind his house was simple. Rough timber walls, a thatched roof that leaked in the heaviest rains, the floor covered in straw that smelled of dust and animal warmth. One horse was strong and fast and never stumbled. Its coat was dark and glossy, its legs muscled, its stride so smooth that riding it felt less like sitting on an animal and more like being carried by the wind. The other horse was older, slower, grey around the muzzle, and sometimes lost its footing on the steep mountain trails, pausing to test the ground with its hooves before taking the next step, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned that speed is not the same as safety. The man cared for the strong horse with great pride, grooming it each morning, feeding it the best grain, showing it off to visitors who came to admire it. The older horse he neglected. He fed it last, with whatever grain remained. He did not groom its mane. He spoke to it with impatience when it hesitated on the trails, as though its slowness were a personal insult, a reflection of some failure in himself that he did not want to examine. One winter, the mountain road became icy. The strong horse, accustomed to moving quickly and never trained in caution, slipped on a frozen bend and fell, injuring its leg. The older horse, the one that had learned to move slowly, to test each step, to feel the ground beneath its hooves, before committing its weight, carried the man safely down the mountain without a single misstep. That evening, sitting by the fire, the man looked at the older horse standing quietly in the stable. He had spent years treating it as though its slowness were a failure, and it had been the careful, patient, cautious one, the one he had been ashamed of, that had carried him home. The Buddha, who noticed patterns in human behavior, the way a river notices stones, once observed that you can search the whole world over and never find anyone more deserving of your love than yourself. This is not vanity. It is not selfishness. It is the recognition that the self you carry through the world, the self that gets tired, that makes mistakes, that sometimes stumbles on the icy road, is not your enemy. It is the horse that carries you home. And how you treat it matters more than almost anything else. In a house with a red front door, on a street where the trees had grown so large that their branches met overhead and formed a kind of tunnel, there lived a man who taught music at a school for young children. He was patient with the children, endlessly, remarkably patient. When a 7-year-old played the same wrong note for the 15th time, he would smile and say, "That is okay. Let us try again. Your fingers are still learning." When a shy student refused to sing in front of the class, he would kneel beside them and say, "You do not have to sing today. You can just listen." Listening is also a kind of music. The children loved him. The parents trusted him. His colleagues described him as the kindest person they knew. But at night, in the hours after the school was locked and the instruments were put away and the house on the tree-lined street was quiet, the kindness disappeared. Not toward anyone else, toward himself. He would sit at the piano in his living room and play the pieces he had been working on for years. Complex, demanding pieces that required a precision he had never quite achieved. And each time his fingers faltered, each time a passage came out rough instead of smooth, a voice inside him would say things he would never say to the worst student he had ever taught. Things like, "You are not good enough. You will never be good enough. A real musician would have mastered this by now. You are a fraud, and everyone who praises you is either lying or too polite to tell you the truth." The living room was small and warm, with bookshelves along one wall and a window that looked out onto the backyard, where a maple tree dropped its leaves in autumn, in slow, spiraling circles that he sometimes watched instead of practicing, because watching the leaves felt like a kind of forgiveness he could not give himself. The piano was old, an upright his grandmother had given him when he was 9, with yellowed keys and a tone that was slightly too bright, like a voice that has been smiling for too long. He kept it tuned. He polished the wood. He cared for it, the way he cared for everything and everyone except himself. One evening, after a particularly brutal session of self-criticism, he had been working on a piece by Debussy for 3 months, a piece that required the kind of delicate, floating touch that seemed to come naturally to the pianists he admired on recordings, but that eluded him the way smoke eludes a closing hand. He had played the middle section 7 times, and 7 times his left hand had faltered at the same passage, and 7 times the voice inside had delivered its verdict with increasing sharpness. By the 7th attempt, the voice was not even using words. It was just a feeling, a heavy, grey, familiar feeling that settled over him like fog. He closed the piano lid and sat in the silence. The house was so quiet he could hear the clock in the kitchen ticking, and the furnace clicking on, and the faint, distant sound of a dog barking somewhere on the next street. And into that silence, a thought arrived, not like a thunderbolt, but like a leaf falling from the maple tree, slowly, turning in the air, landing without a sound. He thought, if one of my students played this piece the way I just played it, what would I say to them? And he knew immediately what he would say. He would say, you are doing beautifully. This is a difficult piece. The fact that you are attempting it at all shows courage. The parts you have already learned are lovely. The parts you have not learned yet, they will come. Be patient with yourself. Your fingers are still learning. He sat with this for a long time. The maple tree outside the window was bare. It was late autumn, and the last leaves had fallen days ago, and the branches were dark and intricate against the streetlight, like a drawing made by someone who understood that beauty does not require decoration, that sometimes the most beautiful thing is the structure itself, stripped of everything unnecessary. And he realized, in that quiet room, with the ticking clock and the old piano and the bare tree, that he had spent his entire adult life offering compassion to everyone who walked through his classroom door and keeping none of it for himself. He had built a career, a beautiful, meaningful career, on the belief that every student deserves patience and understanding, and the space to be imperfect. That stumbling is part of learning. That wrong notes are just notes that have not found their place yet. And then he had gone home each night and sat at this piano and denied himself every one of those things. He had been 2 people, one for the world and one for the quiet hours alone. And the one he kept for himself was the cruelest person he knew. He opened the piano lid again. He placed his hands on the keys, and he played the piece, the whole piece, including the middle section, and it was not perfect. His left hand stumbled at the same passage, but this time, instead of the voice, there was silence, and in the silence, something that felt almost like permission. He played the wrong note, and he let it be wrong, and he kept going, and the piece, imperfect and human and real, filled the small room with a sound that was, for the first time, enough. Pema Chodron, who has written more honestly about self-compassion than perhaps anyone alive, once said something that cut straight to the center of this. She said that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It is a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness, well, can we be present with the darkness of others. What she was saying is that the compassion you offer to your students, your friends, your children, your partner, that compassion does not come from a place of having it all figured out. It comes from a place of knowing what it feels like to struggle. And if you can sit with someone else's imperfection with tenderness, then you already have the skill to sit with your own. You already know how. You have simply not turned the chair to face inward. There is a second story here, quieter, set in a different kind of room, but reaching toward the same gentle truth. A woman who worked as a nurse in a hospital ward for elderly patients was known among her colleagues for her steadiness. She held the hands of frightened patients. She spoke softly to those who were confused, repeating their names, and the names of their family members until recognition returned to their eyes like light. Returning to a room when the curtains are drawn, she sat with people in their last hours, not speaking, just being present. Because she believed. She knew in her bones that no one should have to face the dark alone. Her apartment was small and tidy, on the 3rd floor of a building near the hospital. The bedroom window looked out onto a courtyard where a single magnolia tree bloomed each spring in enormous white flowers that smelled like lemon and honey, and something she could never quite place. Something that reminded her of childhood, though she could not say why. The kitchen was narrow, with just enough room for a small table, where she ate her meals alone, usually standing, usually quickly, as though eating were a task to be completed, rather than an experience to be had. She took care of everyone. That was her identity, her purpose, the thing she offered the world in exchange for the right to exist. But taking care of herself was something she had never learned to do. Not because she lacked the knowledge, but because she had somehow absorbed the belief that her own needs were less important than other people's needs. That attending to herself was selfish. That the ache in her lower back, and the fatigue that never fully lifted, and the loneliness that sat in her apartment, like a piece of furniture she walked around but never acknowledged. These were not problems to be solved. They were simply the cost of being useful. One night, after a particularly long shift, 12 hours that felt like 22 emergencies, back to back, paperwork that blurred before her eyes, and a patient she had grown close to over the past 3 weeks, passing quietly in the early hours of the morning, while she held his hand and watched the monitor's line go flat and felt the warmth slowly leaving his fingers. She came home and sat on the edge of her bed without turning on the light. She did not take off her shoes. She did not hang up her coat. The room was dark except for the street light, filtering through the thin curtains, casting a faint orange glow across the ceiling that moved slightly when the wind moved the branches of the magnolia tree outside. She was too tired to shower, too tired to eat, too tired to do anything except sit there and feel the weight of the day pressing down on her, like water pressing against a dam that has held for too long. And then, without planning to, she did something she had never done before. She placed her hand on her own chest, flat, palm down, the way she placed her hand on the chests of frightened patients, to help them feel that they were not alone. And she said, in a voice so quiet it was barely more than a breath, "It is okay. You did enough today. You are allowed to rest." The words were simple. She had said them 100 times to patients, to families, to new nurses, who were overwhelmed by the weight of what the job asked of them. But she had never once said them to herself, and the effect was immediate and startling. A warmth that spread from her hand through her chest and into her shoulders and down her arms, a loosening, a releasing, as though something that had been locked for years had finally been given the key. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, her hand on her chest, crying quietly, not from sadness, but from the relief of finally being held by herself, by the one person she had forgotten to take care of. The Buddha, in one of his most compassionate teachings, compared the self to a guest house. Each morning, he said, a new arrival, a joy, a sorrow, a shame, a dark thought. Welcome each of them, even the unexpected visitors, because each has been sent as a guide. This is not a teaching about tolerating your flaws. It is a teaching about hospitality, about greeting yourself with the same warmth you would offer a guest who arrived at your door, tired and hungry, and in need of a place to rest. Shunryu Suzuki said something similar in his quiet way. He said, "You are perfect just as you are, and you could use a little improvement. Both things at the same time, not one or the other. You are complete and you are still growing. You are enough and you are still becoming. These are not contradictions. They are the two hands of compassion, one holding you steady, the other gently reaching forward. Tonight, in this dark and quiet hour, perhaps you can offer yourself the thing you would so easily offer a friend. Not a grand gesture, not a resolution to change, just a small, warm acknowledgement. The kind the nurse gave herself with her hand on her chest. The kind the music teacher almost gave himself by the piano. You are here, you showed up for another day. You carried what was given to you to carry, and now you can rest. Not because you have earned it, not because you have completed everything on the list, but because rest is not a reward for the deserving. Rest is a right. It belongs to you the way breath belongs to you, not because you asked for it, but because you are alive. Perhaps, right now, you can place your attention, just your attention, nothing more, on the place in your body where you hold the hardest feelings. Maybe it is the chest, maybe the throat, maybe the space behind the eyes where tears live before they fall. You do not need to fix what you find there. You do not need to understand it, or explain it, or make it better. You can simply notice it the way you would notice a child, sitting quietly in the corner of a room, with curiosity, with gentleness, with the kind of attention that says, I see you. You are allowed to be here. You do not have to be different than you are. Let the breath come slowly. Let the body sink deeper into rest. You have been so much kinder to the world than you have been to yourself. Tonight, let some of that kindness come home. When you are ready, we will continue together. We are nearing the end of our journey now, and there are just a few more stories to share. Stories that gather together everything we have traveled through tonight and carry it gently toward rest. We have come a long way together tonight. Through valleys where the fog came down like a curtain, through workshops and kitchens and monastery courtyards, through stories of tea growers and watchmakers, of potters and photographers, of nurses and music teachers, and a woman who built mandalas on the sand each morning, knowing the tide would take them before noon. We have sat with anger and found that it was not the enemy we were told it was. We have looked at impermanence and discovered that it is not a thief but a gift, the very thing that makes each moment worth noticing. We have traveled through the ordinary and found, hiding in plain sight, something that many people spend their whole lives searching for in extraordinary places. And now the journey is drawing to a close, not because there is nothing left to say. There is always more to say. Always another story waiting in the wings. Always another quiet truth to uncover. But because the night is deep now, and your body has been listening for a long time, and there is a wisdom in knowing when to stop speaking and simply rest. Before we do, let us return to two of the threads we followed tonight, not to explain them again, but to feel them one more time, in a different light. The way a familiar song sounds different when you hear it late at night. The first thread was about the grip. The tea grower standing in her workshop, holding the teapot harder than the weight required. The watchmaker winding his spring tighter than the mechanism could bear. The man by the river, filling his shelves with things he did not need because the feeling of not enough was louder than the evidence of his own cupboard. All of them holding, all of them gripping, all of them exhausting themselves, not with the doing, but with the desperate need to control what cannot be controlled. And what each of them discovered. The tea grower with her softening hands, the watchmaker on his quiet walk home, the man sitting on the flooded step with a cup of tea he had not made, was not a technique. It was not a method or a strategy. or a 5-step plan. It was a release, a simple, physical, almost involuntary release. The fingers uncurling, the jaw loosening, the shoulders dropping that fraction of an inch that changes everything. Not because the problems were solved, not because the wind stopped blowing, or the rain stopped falling, or the lists stopped growing, but because for one moment they stopped carrying things that were never theirs to carry. And in that moment of not carrying, they found that the world did not fall apart. It simply continued the way it always continues, the way the tide comes and goes, the way the leaves fall and return, the way the night becomes morning, without anyone having to make it happen. The second thread was about attention. The monk in the kitchen washing rice as though rice were the only thing in the universe. The woman in the countryside cottage holding a cup of tea with both hands and tasting it, really tasting it, for the first time in years. The old woman sweeping her kitchen floor not because it was dirty, but because sweeping was how she said goodnight to her house. All of them doing the most ordinary things imaginable, and all of them finding, in the ordinariness, something that the scholar with his 30 years of study had been looking for in the wrong direction. The sacred is not somewhere else. It never was. It is in the weight of the blanket on your body right now. It is in the sound of your own breathing. That quiet, rhythmic, faithful sound that has been with you since the moment you were born and will be with you until the very end. It is in the darkness of this room, which is not empty, but full of rest, full of quiet, full of the kind of peace that does not need to be earned, because it was never taken away. You do not need to travel anywhere to find it. You do not need to study anything to understand it. You only need to stop, just for a moment, just for this moment, and notice that it is already here. There is one more story I would like to share with you tonight. It is the last story, and it is the simplest, and it is about a person who is not remarkable in any way that the world would recognize. In a small apartment above a laundromat, on a street where the buses ran until midnight, and the neon sign of the pharmacy across the road cast a faint green glow through the bedroom curtains, there lived a woman who worked at a library. She was not the head librarian. She was not in charge of anything dramatic or important. She shelved books. She checked books in and checked them out. She helped people find things. Not just books, but sometimes the reading glasses they had left on the table by the window, or the car keys that had slipped between the cushions of the armchair in the children's section, or the courage to ask for help, which is a thing that many people misplace without realizing it. Her apartment was small. A kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, with a window that did not close properly and let in a thin draft of cold air in winter that she had learned to think of as the building's way of breathing. The kitchen had a table with 2 chairs, though she lived alone, because her mother had taught her that you should always have a chair for someone who might stop by. No one stopped by very often, but the chair was always there. And she kept it clean, and sometimes she set a cup of tea on the table in front of it, just to make the room feel less empty, and then she drank the tea herself, standing by the window, watching the street below. She had not had an easy life. She did not talk about this, and you would not know it from looking at her. She was the kind of person whose difficulties lived beneath the surface, like roots beneath pavement, invisible but shaping everything above. She had lost people. She had struggled with money. She had spent years in a relationship that diminished her so. Slowly, she did not notice it happening, until one morning, she looked in the mirror and did not recognize the person looking back. She had rebuilt herself after that, not dramatically, not in the way rebuilding is shown in movies, with montages and triumphant music, and a clear moment of transformation. She rebuilt herself the way a wall is rebuilt after a storm, one brick at a time. Some of them placed crooked, some of them replaced twice. The whole process so slow and undramatic that no one watching would have called it brave. But it was brave. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. Each morning, she woke early, not because she had to, but because she liked the hour before the world accelerated. She made coffee in a small stovetop pot that her grandmother had given her, and the smell of the coffee filled the apartment the way a voice fills a quiet room, warm, present, unhurried. She drank it sitting at the table by the window, watching the light change on the street below. The pharmacy sign flickered off at 6. The first bus arrived at 6:15, its headlights sweeping across the wet road like searchlights, looking for something they would never find. The bakery on the corner opened at 6:30, and if the wind was right, the smell of bread reached her window by 7. Yeast and butter, and the faintly sweet scent of dough that has been allowed to rise overnight, slowly, in its own time. She did not meditate. She did not practice mindfulness in any formal sense. She had never read a book about Buddhism, had never heard of Dogen or Shunryu Suzuki, or the concept of anicca, but she did something that the monks and the teachers and the scholars had been pointing toward for 2,500 years. She paid attention, not to extraordinary things, to ordinary things, to the weight of the coffee cup in her hand, to the particular shade of grey the sky turned just before dawn, to the sound the library door made when it opened, a soft pneumatic sigh, like the building exhaling, and the sound it made when it closed behind the last patron at the end of the day. She noticed these things, the way you notice the face of someone you love, not because you are trying to, but because attention is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go. At the library, she moved through her days with a quietness that some people mistook for shyness and others mistook for sadness, but which was, in fact, neither. It was presence. When she shelved a book, she shelved that book, feeling the weight of it, reading the spine, placing it precisely where it belonged, her fingers touching the shelf, with a care that the book itself would never know about, but that mattered anyway, the way all invisible care matters. When a child came to the desk and asked for help finding a book about dinosaurs, she did not point to a section and turn away. She walked with the child to the shelf, knelt down to their height, and pulled out 3 books, and said, "This one has the best pictures. This one has the most facts. And this one is my favorite, because the dinosaurs in it seem very real and a little bit lonely, and I think lonely dinosaurs deserve to be read about." She was not trying to be profound. She was not trying to embody any teaching. She was simply living, carefully, attentively, with a gentleness that extended to the books she shelved, and the strangers she helped, and the cup of coffee she drank each morning by the window. And, on her best days, to herself, she made mistakes. She lost her patience sometimes, snapped at a colleague on a bad day, forgot to call back a friend who needed her, spent an entire Sunday on the couch, watching television she did not care about, because the effort of doing anything else felt like climbing a mountain in wet shoes. She lay awake some nights with the familiar hum of not enough vibrating in her chest. Not enough accomplished, not enough connection, not enough of whatever invisible currency the world seemed to run on. And on those nights she did not practice any technique or recite any mantra or reach for a book of wisdom. She simply lay there and breathed and waited for the feeling to pass, which it always did, eventually, the way weather always passes, the way everything always passes. Sometimes it took an hour, sometimes it took until 3 in the morning. When the pharmacy sign seemed especially green, and the street was so quiet, she could hear the traffic lights changing. A soft click, mechanical and patient, red to green to red again, asking nothing of anyone. And on the mornings after those difficult nights, she got up anyway. She made the coffee. She drank it by the window. She went to work and shelved the books and helped the children find the dinosaurs. Not because she felt better. Sometimes she did not feel better at all, but because she had learned, not from a teacher, not from a text, but from the accumulated evidence of her own quiet life, that showing up is its own kind of faith, that the coffee tastes the same, whether you slept well or badly, that the light changes on the street at the same pace, regardless of what you are carrying. That being alive is not about feeling good. It is about being here, fully, stubbornly, tenderly here, and in the living of this unremarkable life, in the coffee and the shelving and the quiet attention to things that no one else noticed. She had found something that many people spend decades searching for in retreats and seminars and self-help books and mountaintop monasteries. She had found that the life she was living was already enough, not because it was perfect, not because everything had worked out, but because she was here, paying attention, and the paying attention itself was the thing she had been looking for. The sacred was not somewhere else. It was in the weight of the book in her hand, in the smell of the bread from the bakery, in the green glow of the pharmacy sign at 3 in the morning when she could not sleep. And even that, even the sleeplessness, even the loneliness, even the ache was part of it. All of it was part of it. Nothing was excluded. Nothing was wasted. She did not know the word anicca, but she lived it, letting each day arrive and depart without trying to hold it. She did not know the word tanha, but she had learned to recognize the hum of wanting and to let it be there without feeding it. She did not know the story of the tea grower or the watchmaker, but her hands held the coffee cup the way the monk held his, loosely, tenderly, the way you hold something you love and know you cannot keep. On the night we find her, she is lying in bed in her small apartment. The laundromat below has gone quiet. The last load finished an hour ago, and the only sound is the faint ticking of the dryers cooling down, a metallic clicking that sounds almost like rain. The pharmacy sign casts its green glow on the ceiling. The draft from the bathroom window touches her face like a cool hand. She is not asleep yet, but she is close, hovering in that gentle space between waking and rest, where thoughts lose their edges and the body begins to feel less like a thing you carry and more like a thing that carries you. She takes a slow breath. She does not count it. She does not observe it. She simply breathes, and the breathing is enough. If this brought you some peace tonight, you are welcome to subscribe for more long-form audio like this, and share it with anyone who could use a slower night. Original commentary, stories, and script written and produced by Moonlit Dharma. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. And now, as the stories settle and the words grow quieter, perhaps you notice that your body has already begun its own journey toward rest. It has been listening all this time, not just to the words, but to the spaces between the words, to the rhythm beneath the rhythm, to the warmth of the voice moving through the dark, like a hand moving slowly across the surface of still water. Perhaps the shoulders have dropped so far now that you can no longer remember what it felt like to hold them high. They are resting now, truly resting, not just pausing between efforts, but resting the way stones rest at the bottom of a river, settled and still and exactly where they belong. Perhaps the jaw has released completely. That small, familiar clenching that you carry through the day, like a fist you forgot to open. And now the teeth are slightly eye-parted, and the tongue is resting softly against the roof of the mouth, and the whole face has softened into something that looks very much like peace. The muscles around the eyes have loosened. The forehead, which furrows so often during the day, without you knowing it, has smoothed. Even the scalp, which holds tension that most people never think to notice, may have softened. A subtle release, barely perceptible, like a knot untying itself in slow motion. Perhaps the hands, wherever they are resting, on the blanket, on the pillow, against the warmth of your own body, feel heavier than they did when we began. Not a burdensome heaviness, a good heaviness. The heaviness of something that has been allowed to stop reaching, stop gripping, stop holding. The heaviness of permission. The fingers may have uncurled completely now, lying open and loose, receiving nothing, releasing nothing, simply being. The feet, too, may have grown warm and distant, belonging to you still, but only loosely, the way a boat belongs to the shore it is drifting from. The legs feel long and still. The hips have settled into the mattress. The lower back, which holds so much of the day's tension without ever being thanked for it, may have finally released its grip, sinking into the surface beneath you, the way water sinks into sand, slowly, gratefully, without resistance. And the breath has been doing its faithful work all this time, asking nothing of you, expecting nothing, simply coming and going like the tide on the beach, where the mandala was drawn this morning. You do not need to guide it. You do not need to deepen it or slow it. It is already slow. It is already deep. It has been waiting all day for this moment. The moment when you stop asking it to be anything other than what it is. The night outside is holding you. The mattress beneath you is holding you. The blanket around you is holding you. And the stories we have shared tonight, they are not gone. They have settled into you the way rain settles into the earth, quietly, invisibly, finding the places where they are needed most. You will not remember all of them. That is as it should be. The ones you need will stay. The ones you need will surface when you least expect them. While you are washing dishes, or walking to work, or lying in the dark on some future night, looking for a softer way to end the day. The tea grower is standing in her workshop, holding the teapot with loosened hands. The watchmaker is walking home through quiet streets, the music drifting down from somewhere above. The woman on the beach is pouring gold sand into a spiral that the tide will take. And she is smiling, because she knows that the taking is not the end. The nurse is sitting on the edge of her bed, her hand on her own chest, saying the words she has said 1,000 times to others, and never once to herself. It is okay. You did enough. You can rest now. And the woman in the apartment above the laundromat is breathing, just breathing. The pharmacy sign glows green on her ceiling. The dryers tick their quiet countdown. The draft from the window touches her face. And the night, this particular night, which will never come again, holds her gently, the way the night has always held everyone who was willing to be held. You are one of those people tonight. You are here. You are breathing. You are resting. And the resting is not a small thing. It is not a pause between important activities. It is not a concession to weakness. The resting is the bravest thing you can do at the end of a day that asked so much of you. So let your eyes close, if they have not already. Let the last traces of effort leave your body. The last held muscle, the last clenched thought, the last quiet worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will come with its own light and its own questions and its own stories. But that is tomorrow. Tonight belongs to rest. Let the breath carry you, the way a river carries a leaf. Not to any particular place, not toward any goal or destination, but forward, gently, softly, into the quiet that is waiting for you just beyond the next breath, and the next, and the next. Each breath a little slower, each breath a little deeper, each breath taking you one small step further from the day, and one small step closer to the deep, warm, patient sleep that has been waiting for you all along. The way morning waits behind the night, not impatiently, not urgently, but with the calm certainty of something that knows it will arrive. Good night. You are held, you are enough, and the morning, when it comes, will find you rested.